There we go. Good morning, or good afternoon at this point.
Good afternoon.
Apologize for being a couple of minutes late. I actually have the best reason ever. I was engrossed in Torah study and lost track of the time. Yeah, I don't know that there's a better excuse than that. All right, welcome, Lou. I see you're on the road, so drive safely as we're going. Everybody else, it's good to see you. And let's just get started. As I mentioned last week, today we'll do Unit 5. Next week, when we were supposed to be off, I'll teach the class, and that'll catch us up to Unit 6, and then we're back on the pattern. Okay, so just put that in your notes. We will meet next week as well. All right. For the rabbis, Torah means a lot more than simply the 5 books attributed to Moses. For them, when they use the word Torah, it really reflects the divine wisdom, which actually existed before the world came into creation. It was the blueprint upon which creation followed its proper course. Torah includes all possible knowledge of God's will and what God's will is for his chosen people in terms of how we are to live. All things, from the most trivial to the most sublime, everything can be found within it. And so the result is that the Torah becomes a way of elevating the routine. You've heard me say this before, elevating the routine to a status of sanctity and a way of connecting with God. That was the rabbinic understanding of what Torah in its big picture really means. So let's do a little bit of history here. Within a century of the destruction of the temple, the Second Temple, the rabbis had started organizing what we know as the oral law. It was considered a supplement to the written law, and it enables the Torah, which was fixed by that point, to be able to be continued to be used, because as modern situations arose, new interpretations were required for application to real life. Rabbi Akiva is described as the first compiler of oral law, and by the turn of the 3rd century, the Mishnah is completed by Rabbi Judah Hanassi. The Mishnah probably represents an early attempt to take oral Torah and put it into make it into some kind of authoritative statement of essentially what is the minimal amount of learning required for admittance into rabbinic leadership. It was a curriculum to become a rabbi, if you think about it in those terms. Of note, in terms of the Mishnah, there's a couple important facts. One, it takes a lot for granted. It assumes that you as the reader already know a lot about Jewish practice and Jewish ideas, and it makes little attempt to explain anything. It's really a rule book, but the assumption is you understand what's going on. Secondly, disagreements are never resolved. There is no single answer that gets declared authoritative, and in fact, many of them are explained in very exotic and unclear terms. And then the third thing about the Mishnah is that the non-legal materials are the sort of stories are often used to support or illustrate legal opinions, oftentimes in unclear ways. So the Mishnah, as it was constructed, was a curriculum that assumed a certain, it's like a graduate level text that assumes you've already studied all this in your undergraduate studies. Resolutions are never reached, and it uses non-legal materials to support whatever cases it has. That is an overview on the Mishnah in 3 minutes. Okay. Want to talk about the Apocrypha, Pseudegraphia, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Pseudepigraphia, it's left out a syllable. The term apocrypha literally means hidden, refers to those books that are found in the Hellenistic, the Greek Bible that was canonized in Alexandria, meaning the Christian Church's Septuagint and the Vulgate Bible. It means the books that are included in there that are not found in the traditional Jewish Bible. Okay, so there's a number of books that you'll find. If you pick up the King James Version, you'll find additional books that are in what they would call the Old Testament that the rabbis chose not to include. The second category, the pseudepigraphia, really are books at a certain point it's probably from about the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era. It became very common to attribute your writings to someone of an earlier era. And so we see a lot of the Psalms are attributed to David and to Solomon. There are other books attributed to Solomon. They weren't really written by them, but these later authors found that in order to give them a heavier weight, a greater importance, they labeled them as being produced and being written by earlier greats within Jewish tradition. Any comments or thoughts before I go on? Okay, Dead Sea Scrolls. This you probably have a sense you've heard of them. I know Sarah did a series on them a number of years ago as well. They're a collection of manuscripts that were found in the caves surrounding Qumran and the western shore of the Dead Sea, which are many, we find are many writings of the peoples of the time, as well as materials from the Hebrew Bible. And we'll get into that a little bit more in depth in a few minutes. The Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are books of the Bible in which, through the Greco-Roman period, that ended up being rewritten to make certain kinds of points. Out of reference to the Bible, they sought to extend the biblical tradition and the issues of their own day. Now, I want to reference this back. The Mishnah for Jews did that. They didn't touch the fixed text. They wouldn't touch the Torah, but they did add to it through interpretation. The Apocrypha, by contrast, added text into the very biblical books. And the perfect example of that is the Greek version of Esther, where there are 6 editions that seem to fill out what they felt were concerns for Hellenistic life. So sometime, and this is found in the Septuagint, sometime around the 3rd century before the Common Era, the book of Esther was translated into Greek, and the translators were concerned, rightfully so, that it seemed to lack a religious tone. God's not even mentioned. And so if you look at the version of the book of Esther in the Septuagint, you will find that the story begins with a dream that Mordecai has, which sets the danger and the conflict about to happen. That's not in the book of Esther. You'll find letters of King Ahasuerus that are mentioned in the Hebrew text, but never really described. Suddenly they're described. We have the letters themselves in the Septuagint. You have 2 prayers that are added as well. You have prayers that are attributed to Mordecai and another that's attributed to Esther. When we know Esther approaches the king at a certain point, and she is in danger of her life being taken for approaching him unsummoned, well, we've got a lot more detail there, and it's very exciting. Very exciting. They've built in, it becomes a soap opera. And at the very end, a conclusion is added to the text. So you have all of these extra texts that seem to have found their way into the biblical version of Esther that are now in the Septuagint. And it transforms a mixture of good luck and what seem to be useful coincidences. That's how we generally look at the book of Esther. It turns it into a textbook example of piety answered by divine providence. They throw the role of God back into the text in process. All right. Let's take a little bit more look at some of the books in the Pseudepigraphia and the Dead Sea Scrolls. in the pseudepigraphia, there's a major significance to these documents. They tell us a lot about the period, even though they didn't make it into the Bible, they're later period. They tell us about the people's lives at the time, and they ultimately exert influence upon Jewish history as we go forward. Many of these that I described were found in the Qumran, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We found additions that tell us, because they were locked away very clearly all this time, what was going on in a way that our texts, which have probably been altered over the generations, don't necessarily give us. The Book of Jubilees, for example, is a prime example of this genre of rewritten Bible in which the Second Temple authors recast and retell biblical stories because they have a lesson they want to teach. In my world, that's called Midrash, right? But they built it into the text. There is a section known as the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. It's a group, if you remember at the end of his life, Jacob sits down with his 12 sons in Exodus 49 and says, here's how I describe you, and here's what I see will be the future of your descendants. Here is your future. The book of 12 Patriarchs basically has each of those 12 sons doing the same thing with their children. You won't find that in the Bible. These are later additions. Dead Sea Scrolls. As I mentioned to you, it's a mid-20th century finding, a corpus of material in caves along the Dead Sea. The main body comes from Qumran, but not all of it. It's near the northern end of the Dead Sea, about 8.5 miles south of Jericho. The scholars at this point in time have identified those scrolls as the library of a group of people that lived in this area from the time of the Maccabean revolt of 165-ish until the Great Revolt of 66 to 73 Common Era, about 250 years. That's how they're framing the timing on the writings of the documents and who they come from, and they remained hidden until 1947. They've provided us great. You really cannot overstate the importance of these documents. They help us understand that the biblical text, it was very fluid in that time. It wasn't as finalized as we'd like it to be. Remember, I said to you, it probably didn't get finalized until the 1st century before the Common Era, the entire biblical text. And we learn from the scrolls at Masada and the Bar Kokhba caves that we can trace the early stages of that process and how it became finally accepted, how the Bible was canonized. Ultimately, what those books have done is helped us understand how both Judaism and Christianity emerged in those first centuries. It gave us the background that let us see how Jews went from being a biblical people to a rabbinic people, and at the same time, how Christianity built its own new Bible in its own way. That's what they provide us, and you can't overstate that. They also tell us that the kind of practices we know today were already being practiced: tefillin, daily prayer, birkat hamazon. Their ritual, they built in rituals. Now they had a specific goal. The mitzvahs, the rituals they're building, they believed was a preparation for the soon to dawn end of days, messianic times. It was a time of great stress. I've said this to you over and over. It's suffering. And so they believed that the Messiah was coming, the end of days was coming, and these rituals, these mitzvot, would serve as vehicles to enable that. Now keep in mind, today we don't all agree on the purpose of mitzvot either. The Orthodox would say to you, a mitzvah, the purpose of a mitzvah is simply to obey God. If there's a reason for the mitzvah, you are to ignore all such because that could change. It could be proven wrong. The purpose of mitzvot is obedience to God. If God says pray 3 times a day, you don't stop and process it. You do it. I'll offer you up an alternative through Heschel. Heschel, this is what would make him not an Orthodox Jew. As intense as his practice was, he saw the mitzvot not as an obligation, but as an opportunity to connect with God. That is a difference. So the mitzvot over time have been used in different ways. In the early times of the Qumran caves, they were used as a way of enabling the coming of the Messiah, which they thought was happening. Any comments or thoughts?
I just want to suggest, before he was head of Jewish studies at Rice, Matthias Henze used to give classes for years of different subjects. And he did the Dead Sea Scrolls, in fact, brought them here, and you could see the scrolls and told about the history. But 2 books that you studied were in the class was James Vander Pam, and he loved that one. And the other was
I didn't see the book. Hold it up so I can see what it is. Oh, yeah, I actually have that. Okay, go ahead.
That's what I figured.
Yeah.
And that's what you come. But there's also one with it translated, and this is by someone named Florentino Martinez. But what you're saying is basically a lot from those books, and it's all very interesting. And like I say, when he came here, when he brought that all to Houston, it was very interesting. And he had some of the scrolls, open to different places. And I asked, the only question I really was, when you look at God's name, I said, well, it doesn't look like we see in our Torah. And he said, it's Paleo Hebrew.
It's the earlier Hebrew text.
Right.
So, certainly if you haven't been to the shrine of the book in Jerusalem, in Israel, you need to do that. You'll see the texts, and you'll see the difficulty that they've all encountered in terms of trying to one, piece it back together, because it wasn't found in whole scrolls. And there are sections that are literally, here's 3 words and here's 4 words. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle trying to put it together, knowing that there are pieces missing. So it has been a 70-year, 80-year process of making sense of it. And yeah, Matthias Henze has done a great job. I had the opportunity to spend a little bit of study time with Shalom Paul, who was the head of the Dead Seas Committee in Israel, another great scholar. So yeah, it's fascinating. It's more than a course unto its own. More than. All right,
Was the book of the Maccabees part of the Apocrypha?
Yes, they did include the book of the Maccabees.
Because I know it's included in I guess it's the Catholic texts, or
yes, right. The rabbis declared it basically not to be included. There's a number of reasons why they would theologically not have included the books of Maccabees. One is, if you think about the following, when are they writing? They're writing after the temple is destroyed.
Right.
The holiday, the stories of the Maccabees is all about the celebration of the rededication of a temple that no longer exists. And so theologically, they weren't necessarily motivated to include it in the texts. Okay. All right, I want to talk about this great revolt. We keep talking about it. Let's give it a little bit more sense. There is a convergence of factors that lead to the revolt of 66 to 73. First is the ideological. There is a sharp contrast between this people that is struggling with this idea that Israel is the elect. God has chosen them. They are to have a glorious spiritual and political future. Everything, this is what we are, the chosen people. We are in covenant with God. And they're living with the reality of Roman control, and they're nothing more than a vassal. So ideologically, there's a problem. Despite the fact that they have some control in some areas in some ways, there's a sharp contrast between that sense of being elected and the messianic hopes. And so there's a beginning of that. You have all this messianism happening around them at a time in which the ideology doesn't work. And so they believe, we need to begin this process, and then God will step in and help. It's the Nachshon ben Aminadav. I need to put my foot in the water for the sea to split. Okay, and so they believe if they begin this war, God will then take his part in the covenantal relationship and intervene. Needless to say, it didn't happen, right? And they even went so far as to say they justified the whole thing by labeling the Romans as idolaters, because they declared their own emperors to be gods. And in so doing, that justified the need to destroy them. All right, so you have this ideology that needs to be addressed. Secondly, the very behaviors of the Romans have made the Jews, their sensibilities are offended, their way of life is offended. They've got control of the temple. All right, and the Romans institute harsh taxes on the Jewish population. And so you've got a heavy burden on a people that hates the Romans for ideological reasons. So we hate you already, and then you overtax us. In addition, Rome began to support the non-Jewish Greco-Syrian elements as a people. The Gentiles become almost an elite within the Judean society, and they provoke the Romans, all right, and urge the emperor to take measures against the Jews. Rome is engaged in bringing more and more Hellenization to the people. A third aspect of what's going on is Rome is at this point is also preoccupied, as I'll describe in a few minutes, in around the year 68. All right, and so there's chaos. There's no real rule. Things are in chaos. I remember reading about the state of Alaska when the United States passed the desire to buy the land before it was a state. They bought the land in the 1890s. It passed by one vote in the Senate, and the House of Representatives was against the whole idea and refused to fund anything. So now you've got a land that we bought in a very, very close vote by the Senate without any funding, and the rule of chaos was the way of the land. You owned your house until I decided I don't want you to own your house, and I'd come in and take it away from you, or vice versa. It was a land of chaos, and that's that's the world in which people begin to revolt. That was happening in Israel's third aspect. The fourth is it's a social revolution, because you've got a revolt not only against Rome by the masses, but by the upper classes of Jews as well, who are collaborating with Rome. At the end of the day, however, all groups come together. Even the wealthy become disappointed with Rome and the way they're being treated. And so you've got all Jews are really involved in this process of, even the Pharisaic house of Hillel joins in, at the end of the day, joins in this revolution. It comes from all over the country, but what they don't get is any help from either diaspora Jews in Egypt, Jews in Babylonia, or from any of Rome's enemies. It's an internal battle completely. The war broke out in the year 66 CE for all the reasons I just cited. After 128 years since Rome entered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, you now have a revolt. There are about 23,000 Jewish soldiers, a good number, but massively overpowered by the number of Romans that they're trying to beat. Again, they're expecting God to step in and create a miracle here. There were some early defeats of the Romans in little ways. So early in the war, for example, the Jews did recapture Jerusalem, and it was and in 67, Vespasian gets angry and he decides to march from Syria down south, and he's capturing a lot of the Galilee as he's going. And after the loss of Ashkelon and the Galilee in particular, the leadership falls into the hands of the most extreme elements of zealots. And so you've got a lot of zealotry going on in the land. This is not a united people. By 68, knowing that time was on his side, Vespasian says, okay, I've got all of the Galilee. I'm now going to attack Jerusalem. But something happens. Nero commits suicide. And there's a power vacuum in Rome. Civil war breaks out, and for a year and a half, in which all of the competitors for the title of emperor, one at a time, take and are defeated and are defeated and are defeated, until Vespasian, who's leading the revolt and leading the attack on the revolt, is called back to Rome to assume the role of emperor. Okay. And so what you've got during this time is a respite for the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, how would they understand that? How do you theologically understand that? It's the hand of God. All right, we've reached Messianic times. This is great. God has stepped in. He has caused what's happened in Rome so that we will be freed and can rule ourselves. Anybody want to guess how that played out? Yeah, not well, right? Thumbs down, totally. The war ultimately was taken over by Titus, Vespasian's son, and in 69 CE, a year later, the temple is destroyed. The city of Jerusalem is taken over, and it's 73, 3 years later, the fortress of Masada falls, bringing an end to a major era in Jewish history. So that now what you've got is, remember I described to you the ideology earlier. The Jews are chosen. God is supposed to be helping us. We're expecting God to step in, and we have now everything laying in ruins. And the rabbis are left, or the leaders are left, to make sense of what just happened. Sense making is natural human behavior. One of the ways they described is what happened is a result of the hatred among Jews themselves. They labeled it sinat chinam, causeless hatred, and they attributed the whole thing to God's punishment of the Jews. This has probably been a theology that has led to our survival. When things are bad and terrible, the answer has been to double down, as opposed to what happened in other cultures where they just went to the new gods. Jews historically have doubled down and said, it's our fault. We're suffering because it's our fault. And that's a theology that worked really well until the Holocaust, and we've had major problems with it since. But that theology probably kept the Jewish people alive. There were other, again, pause for questions. Okay. Wow, very quiet today. I love questions, so feel free. I'll go on. There were other revolts against Rome as well. So you've got in the years 115 to 117, the Jews of Egypt and Libya revolt against Rome. The causes are not quite clear. It seems very obscure, but it does result in the decimation of the Egyptian Jewish population. A culture that had lived in Alexandria for centuries and centuries and really produced a lot of important documents is suddenly gone. That's 115 to 117. And then another major revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolution, occurs in 132 to 135 after the Common Era. And once again, all of the ideological reasons that we cited before for the first revolt are at play here in the second revolt, but there's one additional reason that's very important. Based on the prophecies of Jeremiah, it had been anticipated that after the destruction of the temple, within 70 years, there would be a return and a reconstruction of the temple. It happened with Cyrus, at the first temple. And it was based on Jeremiah's prophecies, okay? Now, it's almost been 70 years since the second temple has been destroyed. And there's an expectation that there'll be a fulfillment that God will help the Jews rebuild if they rebel. Okay, this is that 70-year period. I cite that 70-year period a lot because I believe it actually in certain ways affects how we think. I look at, anti-Semitism as a general rule, and I would say to you, we've had a 70-year window since World War II in which it's been historically relatively decent. If things were to change now, that would fulfill that 70-year period in that concept. I'm not hoping for that. Obviously, but it is a way in which we understand Jewish history. Things happen in periods of 70. It was a premeditated rebellion. They deliberately did this. It's supported by the sages, including Rabbi Akiva, who eventually perishes at the hands of the Romans. It ends in a total bloodbath of the Jewish population. Between the two wars, 1/3 of the Jewish population, the equivalent to the Holocaust, is gone. 1/3 of all Jews in the world are killed. At that point, all rebellion is over. Rome has control, and it can maintain control for centuries. That really is the end of all rebellion. All right. I find that period depressing, obviously, and we have this whole holiday dedicated to this period of time. Both temples destroyed. It's called Tisha B'Av. Look back. Let's go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah is now in process of being written. The word Mishnah comes from the root shana, to repeat. The word year, if you think, we think here shana, the word year means repeat. You're repeating a cycle. The Mishnah, the word means to repeat, and it essentially reflects a text that is learned by memorization and repetition, since it was not written down. It had to be memorized. It makes no attempt, important distinction, makes no effort at imitating the Hebrew of the Tanakh, as do the writers of the Dead Sea Scroll. The Hebrew is completely different. It has its own language, it has its own style, and it's a style meant to enable memorization. It has a cadence with rhyme and mnemonic devices. But what you also see is a text that is learned by memorization also serves to include the few, not the many. By definition, most people are not going to be able to do that. This oral Torah, together with that which follows it, gradually evolves into a fixed corpus that is written and in certain ways replaces the written Torah as the main object of Jewish study. The rabbis studied Mishnah, all right, which is the attempt to understand what the Torah says in many ways. The Tanaim, all right, let me just give you two terms, the Tanaim and the Amoraim. The Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnaic period. The latter rabbis of the Talmudic period are referred to as the Amoraim. Okay, the Tanaim are the ones who took this and created a systematic way of putting the Mishnah together. And it ultimately culminates in the redaction of the Mishnah somewhere between 200 and 225 of the Common Era, and there are different opinions on within that time frame of when it was. Going back a little bit, I want to go back to the Pharisees for a second. The Pharisees took all of these traditions that happened, in a sense, folkways, and they created an oral law out of it. But nowhere do the Pharisees assert that those folkways and those additions to Torah life, those interpretations of Torah life, none of the Pharisees make the claim that any of that came from Sinai. It is the Tanaim, it is the later rabbis of Mishnaic times, who now have a responsibility for creating a new way of Judaism, absent a temple and absent any kind of sacrificial system. They now have to recreate a Judaism, and so they take those folkways and they make the claim that all of those were also given at Sinai, and therefore they take on the importance of Torah. But you can see the motivation for doing so in a way the Pharisees never had the need to do. What the Mishnah is also doing, and you'll see this in the Talmud as well, and it's what we do today. I've said to you many times, we are not Torah Jews, we're Rabbinic Jews. We live Judaism, we live the Torah through the lens of the rabbis, how they understood it. And that's what enables the Torah, in a sense, to be an eternal document. When electricity gets created and introduced, I promise you, you will not find the Torah addressing this. As I'm doing a lesson on surrogacy. The Torah kind of hints at it in certain ways, but it really doesn't address the issue. All kinds of medical ethics are not. It is the rabbinic interpretation of Torah that enables Torah to be a document that survives and is eternal. Does that make sense? And so what you have at this time is a document, a Mishnah and Talmud is a document that builds upon itself. Each generation is taking the arguments of the previous generation and building and constructing and using precedent to build new ideas. All right. Any comments on Mishnah? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what was done today is not applicable, in my opinion. I know this.
Tell me what you mean.
Okay, we're not going to go back to the time of the Pharisees and the priests.
Right.
Because we're not going to have a third temple.
Well, the Orthodox pray for it. Sheyibana Beit HaMikdash.
I know, but also our prayer book, if you go in, there's an alternate prayer.
That's right.
To say.
That's exactly true. Yep.
But when I say that, I do that. We have many members of the congregation here that say, well, that wouldn't be right. I say the original prayers. In other words, you're praying for all these things that are never going to happen, or if they do happen, most people do not believe in going into that and doing it.
Right. The prayer book is a great document for struggling with theology, for sure.
Right.
Right.
I mean, even with the Amida itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't say Sheyibana Beit HaMikdash, the hope for a third temple either, because I don't see us, I can't imagine a world in which God expects us to go back and rip up animals and burn them. But right, we've through God's wisdom. The weekday Amidah also says, you give man wisdom, and we use that wisdom to progress.
That's the first prayer, and you couldn't have all the other prayers without that. Right. But that's not the belief of everybody. What you're saying, I happen to agree with you 100%. But it makes a problem in all of this. Even with Reform Jews, it's even more of a problem because they don't know any of this stuff. I mean, I know a lot of them.
I think that, if you talk to Reform rabbis, they've got a great background in history.
Yes.
But do I think that the general I don't think the general population of conservative synagogues knows it either.
No, but I mean, I know because I know how Beth Israel was, how the people of my generation were taught there. So I know how everything is. But even here, even in conservative at Bris Shalom, it works. Yeah, sure. It's the same. Well, not everybody has your opinion.
And I get that. And again, oftentimes I've made the distinction that I'm speaking in this setting as a historian, not as a theologian. Okay, right. There are ways within my own identity in which those two pieces compete, and I struggle.
I think everybody that learns history has a lot of time has that trouble if you were brought up with all of this as part of your life.
As I get older, I have to tell you, I become more of a historian. All
I
right, because
totally understand that. I was discussing some of the things with my sister who doesn't practice Judaism anymore,
Mhm.
and how it's rabbinic and it's not, like the restrictions on Shabbat. And I was explaining what some very Orthodox people do, where they won't even tear toilet paper on Shabbat. And it's like, she said,
I grew up in a conservative household where that didn't happen. We
okay,
didn't tear
well,
right?
so yeah, and conservative goes from one end
Right.
to the other, let's face that. But,
Right.
and it was just having an interesting discussion with her about what I believe and what I don't believe.
Right.
It brings up your questions in yourself.
So I want to finish up with a couple things, and then I'll take any kinds of questions. Okay. First, there's a chart that I sent. I don't know if you have it. That there's a chart number 1. It says the Tanaim, and it gives you what essentially are 5 generations of rabbis. But this is after the Pharisees. The last of the generations of the Pharisees were really Hillel and Shammai. And it picks up with the first generation, which are the houses of Hillel and Shammai, meaning they're students. The first generation of the Mishnah is, a lot of them were from the Hillel and Shammai schools. All right. The second generation, and that's prior to the Great Revolt. The second generation is during and after the revolt from, after the revolt from about 90 to 130 till just before the Bar Kokhba revolution. And that's a group of people that really is taking on the struggle of reconstructing what Judaism is going to look like, minus a temple. The third generation are those that were in the Bar Kokhba era and afterwards, from 130 to 160, probably includes Rabbi Meir, who began the editing of the Mishnah. So before this period, you have people building Mishnah texts. Rabbi Meir begins the process of putting it all together in some organized fashion, and he does it based on the subject divisions that he learned from Rabbi Akiva. The fourth generation, from 160 to 200, is the generation of Rabbi Judah Hanassi, who ultimately edits and finalizes, redacts and finalizes the Mishnah as we generally have it today. And the fifth generation are those post that time. They're said to be semi-Tanaim. I don't even know what that means. We weren't sure what to label them, is what that means. Primarily the younger contemporaries of Judah Hanassi after the Mishnah was redacted. All right, so you've got 5 generations here. If you read through the Mishnah, you'll see all of these names. This may give you, as you're doing so, a time frame and understanding of why certain rabbis were saying certain things, what was going on at the time in their lives. Okay, I think that chart is important. I also want to now go into Midrash as well. I want 2 areas that the Mishnah addresses. One is law, and the other is Agadah. So halacha and midrash. Halacha is law. A lot of the Mishnah's laws are what are known as apodictic laws, meaning they're unconditional legal prescriptions that have no reasons for them. Yeah, do this. It's a chok. That's what we call it in the Torah, the red heifer. It's called a chok, a chukah. All right? It's an unexplained law. Just do it. Each generation was taking what the previous generation did and continued to develop it. So you've got the laws that develop. You also have storylines. And I'm going to spend a lot of next week talking about Midrash as well. There's stories and legends that were designed to attract followers to Rabbinic Judaism, because they don't have, the rabbis at this time may have a little bit of power, but they're certainly far from the majority. Okay, and so they're building ways of understanding the text that they have in what we might use today. We'd say, if you teach a kid, you want to teach a kid about math, what are you going to do? You take and say, John went into the store, he had $1. All right, the item was 49 cents. How much money does he have left? There are stories that illuminate what they're trying to do. but they're not binding in the same way. So that's important. The halacha, the legal documents were binding, but the midrash never does become binding because it isn't meant to be. And as a matter of fact, you can have midrashim, and you do have often, that contradict one another. And that's perfectly fine. It's like sermons, because that's what they originally were. They were sermons in a sense. I can give you one interpretation this year about last week, Noah. And I told you last week that Noah really missed the mark and he was a bum. Next year, I can turn around and find another midrash that tells you Noah was a tzaddik. And I'm right both times, if I use the midrashim. It's the way we look at life as well. I mean, think about events that have happened in your life. I promise you and other relatives may not see them the same way. Two people can watch a football game and a controversial play. If you're on rooting for different teams, you see different things. Same play, different perspectives, okay? So that's what you've got. The second chart I've given you is essentially the tractates that are in the Mishnah, all right? It's chart number 2. If you were to look, for example, I want to just look at the first one, Zeraim, which is the first section of the Mishnah, all right? So you've got, did I pull the right one out? No, I pulled out the wrong one. But Zeraim contains a number of tractates. The only one that's really relevant for today is the first. You have Brachot is the first Mishnah. It starts out by talking about what time you say Shema, etc. And then you have a whole series of Mishnayot and tractates that talk about that talk about the gleanings of the field and the way in which they lived their agricultural lives, only applying to Israel. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't apply to me. And so the rest of the text, oftentimes, as you'll hear next week, a lot of the Babylonian Talmud just ignores those sections of the Mishnah. Simply ignores it because it's not relevant. The next section, Moed, holidays and festivals, clearly we have reason for following much of that. Nashim, or marriage, women's laws and marriage laws, etc. There's plenty that we pull out of that. Nizikin, or damages and civil law, so it's tort law. All right. The last two sections, Kedoshim and Toarot, are laws about sacrifices and purification. Once again, not very relevant to modern life or life throughout the generations when they weren't in Israel. Okay. The rabbis of the Mishnah were hoping at some point for a return to temple living, and they were looking to normalize for the people the temple practices in the absence of the temple practices. Let's see what else I got. Do I have anything else for? Oh, yeah, I want to talk about the Tosefta. The Tosefta literally means, Musaf means additional. It's the same word, additional. It's an additional section. The Tosefta is a collection of external traditions not found in the Mishnah, but somehow attributed to the writers of the Mishnah. Okay? Doesn't mean they really wrote them. They're attributed to them. It's understood to be a supplement, a commentary on the Mishnah. And in reality, many of the statements that you'll find in the Tosefta cannot be understood independently. If you don't know what the Mishnah is saying, there's no way to make sense of what the Tosefta says. There's a different interpretation, however. Judith Hauptman gives us a different relationship. Do you have reading one in front of you? No, all right. So let me read. I'll read it. Please follow if you do. If you don't, listen, just hear. She says, since 1989, I have been arguing that much of the Tosefta precedes the Mishnah and serves as the basis of the Mishnah. The question naturally arises, how can this Tosefta have been a source of the Mishnah if the Tosefta, in essence, is a wide-ranging commentary on and supplement to the Mishnah? How the sequencing is something, but the question to ask is, to what text is the Tosefta really responding? And this is her answer. A new answer to this is that the Tosefta often comments on a Mishnah, but not the Mishnah we have. Careful examination of a paragraph after paragraph of the Mishnah in the Tosefta, she claims, shows that the Tosefta sometimes quotes a phrase from some other text and explains it, but the quotation, although similar to the Mishnah, does not match word for word. What she is suggesting is that there was an earlier Mishnah that upon which the Mishnah we have and the Tosefta are both commenting. We don't know what it is. We don't have it, but that explains from her end. That explains why some of the Tosefta seems to precede the Mishnah. Some of it seems to comment on it. She's claiming there was a third document that preceded that we no longer have. All right, now I'll take any questions or comments. We got a couple minutes. Stanley, I
Would
see
you resend out those things? I didn't get those.
I'll send it
That
to
was
you.
one-
They're
Okay,
on the
thank you.
synagogue website
Right.
too, because I
Yeah,
just
you
got
should
them.
be right, and it should be in the email that was sent this week. But yes, if you can't get it, send me an. If you can't find it, send me an email and I'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Josephus was which revolution?
He's the first in the
Okay, that's what I
66 to 73.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
But we don't exactly know what happened, right? We only know what he wrote.
So we only have two sources of the history of that time. We have Josephus and we have the Mishnah. Both are wrote subsequently. In the case of the Mishnah, it could be 100 years later, and both have, let's just say, biases.
Yeah,
Josephus is writing to one. He makes himself look wonderful in the text. There are a number of places where he comes out as the hero.
right.
All right. There are also the fact that he's trying to present the war as it exists he's writing to the Romans and trying to present the fact that it's the radicals among the Jews who are responsible for all this, not the general population.
Right, that so
So-
people should be saved.
Right. So therefore, how much of it is accurate is unclear. And the Mishnah is not a history document, it's a theology document. And it chooses and it selects and chooses and rearranges as it needs to. So all we have are really those two sources, and both have their biases, and we can't be sure what really happened.
That's most of history too.
Right. And again, even when we read the rabbis' opinions of the zealots, well, they're not writing objectively. What else? Okay. With that, again, next week, session 6. It wasn't on the original calendar. I'm going to do it. That's the makeup lesson, and then we'll go from there. All right. Have a wonderful week. I hope this was helpful and inspiring in some way. Enjoy.
Thank you.